Hello, Pastor John.
Hello, Pastor Danny.
Very happy to have you on our time together with the Central Conference. Been meaning to have a conversation with you. Would you please introduce yourself to some of our folks that may not know you?
Yeah, so my name is Jon Fogel. I am a pastor in the Central Conference. I pastor Hope Covenant Church in Orland Park, which is a little church kind of located in kind of the middle of the southwestern suburbs.
Mhm.
Um, and I am a pastor full time, but I also have a social media persona, or I play, I'm like pretend to be somebody on the internet. Um, And yeah, so just kind of that persona is called whole parent, but I just do it
Yes.
under my normal name. And yeah, Jon Fogel, whole parent. That's me.
Okay. John, how long have you been at Hope?
I've been at Hope since 2018. So I think it's about 7 years almost, the
Almost
beginning of
7 years.
2018.
As
Yeah.
long as almost as I have been here as a superintendent.
Yeah. I think my graduating seminary class was the first class that you had the pleasure to interview, as I remember.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, not remind, but do you remember how we met the first time?
I think it was that. Yeah, I think we met at North Park Theological Seminary during the conversations, or they used to do interviews, right, for
Yeah.
superintendents.
Mhm.
And I don't know if they still do that, but back in those days, when you were graduating from seminary, if you were going into the pastorate, this you'd meet with all the superintendents in groups of like four,
Mhm.
3 or 4, and yeah, you sat next to me on the very first night, which was
Right.
pretty cool because I already kind of
Yeah.
knew. I don't want to say I knew, but I was already in conversations at that point and was pretty sure I was getting an offer with the Central Conference Church. So
Awesome.
I was trying to cozy up to my future boss, and so it's nice that you
Well,
sat
and I
next to
had no idea. John, I follow you on social media, and I have really marveled at what a great job you've done with a channel that you have on YouTube about whole parenting. And this is one of the reasons why I invited you to be on here, because there's a lot of questions about social media, and I would like to ask you to help us educate some of our pastors and maybe some of our parents. What do you think is the role of social media as it comes into parenting, which is what you're doing right now? That's really well.
Yeah, it's really a double-edged sword. And I say that because in some ways, I have to appreciate that I wouldn't have a platform at all without social media. Um, I have an upcoming parenting book and other things like that, that none of those opportunities would be afforded to me. Uh, and I really do believe a lot of the stuff that I talk about has helped people. And so, in some ways, I think it's really been beneficial for the parents themselves. Um, the reason I say it's double-edged sword is because there's the other side of that, which is parents who are on their phones constantly on social media
Right.
are not nearly as attentive parents.
Mhm.
And so, and then there's the other piece of it is even the ones who are using social media effectively, but they're consuming parenting content, and I talk about this in the book. They may have an unrealistic expectation of parenting or being perfect in some way. And as we know, as pastors, people who are set on perfection are not only doomed to fail, they also have much worse mental health outcomes in the long term. So
Mhm.
people who struggle with perfectionism struggle with depression, they struggle with anxiety. And so those realities make it kind of difficult. I realize on one hand, if nobody had social media, they wouldn't know who I was and they wouldn't be able to learn. And so many people have learned so much positive parenting from social media. Also, it's been harmful. And so you have to kind of balance both those things. And that's not even talking about kids. Obviously,
Right.
social media for kids, that's a whole separate conversation. And in that, there's a lot fewer positives, to be honest, to
Yeah.
be had. So yeah.
So what would you consider a good age if a parent wanted their kids to be on social media? What would consider a good age for them to get started?
Yeah, this is an extreme take for many people hearing this,
Mhm.
and especially people with preteens are going to push back on this. But what we know from the data is that kids who have social media before 16, there is no benefit to their life.
Mhm.
And so 16 may seem extreme, But what we know, and there's a great book about this that came out, I think mid-February of 2024. And it's called The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And it's one of the kind of hot topic books in parenting right now. And the thesis of this book is that anxiety, depression, all of the teen mental health crises that we're seeing in an unprecedented way are coming from primarily two factors. And the first one being not enough independence from kids and not enough freedom to play, kind of helicopter parenting. And then the other
Yeah.
side being access to technology. And what he proposes in the book is that 16 is a healthy age for a kid to get a smartphone and then get access to social media. And so it might not be the first phone that they have. A lot of people, advocate for my son is only 8. He has a smart watch where he can communicate with us, but he can't really do anything else on it. But as far as like an ability to actually get on the internet and partake in social media, the earliest age that I've heard anybody advocate for is 14, and increasingly experts are saying 16.
Yeah. John, you have really had a phenomenal outreach to many people that are interested in being good parents and having good parenting skills. What do you think it's the appeal? I mean, you have over 1 million people that you're reaching through your different channels. What would you say has been the appeal to for these folks to follow you?
Yeah, the thing is, there's so many parallels here to ministry, but
Hmm.
what we have to appreciate is that the place where people are is the place where we can reach them. And so when it comes to ministry, when it comes to talking about positive parenting, which is its own form of ministry, even though I don't often talk about it in those terms,
Mhm.
um, really what it comes down to is wherever people are, that is the only place that we can reach them. And so back in the first century, you see Paul going into synagogues, but also going to places where Greco-Roman society, public square as a whole, where people are gathering, and then Paul is kind of preaching the message. Peter does this too. And the reason why this is important, or the way that Jesus traveled around in the ancient world, the reason why these places are important is because that's where the people were. And I think with social media, now what we have is basically access to almost everyone on the planet,
Mhm.
but specifically by interest. And so if a person, because of the algorithms, is interested in whatever it is that we're talking about, whether that's positive parenting or brain-based parenting, which is what I talk about, or learning guitar, which is something I'm working on with another Covenanter in his own social media platform right now. Learning guitar, right? Like whatever it is that we're talking about, we have an opportunity to reach a massive number of people. Even though it might be a very small segment of the population, it is a huge number of total people because of the number of people on social media.
So, what would you say? It's obviously very difficult to gauge deeply in a 30-second, or in your case, a couple of minute clip. Uh,
Sure.
in the parallels to ministry are very similar, right? We need to spend time with people. How is that a good beginning to a good relationship, either connecting them to church? Because you don't necessarily mention Christ when you talk about parenting, but your roots and the basis of it's really biblical. If you're a
Yeah.
Christian, you will see that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. And the first social media platform that I had was a TikTok related to pastoring. So I reached on that platform before I basically stopped posting on it, like 50,000 followers even there, right? So
Mhm.
it's not that you can't talk about Christianity and gain some traction and have people listen. It's that when you're talking about, in my case, brain-based parenting, which as you kind of alluded to, yeah, it's very fruit of the spirit oriented. I mean, all of those things kind of lend themselves to positive parenting and positive life, fruitful living.
Yeah.
Um, but the thing, I guess, about engaging is that what we have to realize is that oftentimes we think that we have people's full attention long before we actually have people's full attention.
Mhm.
And we think that we have people's buy-in long before we actually have their buy-in. And so on social media, you're not actually trying to engage people deeply. You're just trying to get people's attention.
Yeah.
And then you're hoping that through garnering their attention and building some rapport with them, having a bunch of videos that they like that are helpful to them, then you can get their attention, which is buying your book or participating in a membership, which is what I have done in the past, or whatever it is. And so if I'm looking at this from a purely ministry perspective, really the goal of social media is to provide value to people and to serve people well, and to do so in a way that kind of lacks, is a weird thing to say, but it kind of lacks nuance. That's just kind of bite-sized, and hey, this is
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is helpful to you in the short term, and then you can engage them deeper, because any person who's providing you value on a consistent basis is a person who you're going to want to engage with. And so I talk about it in terms when I've helped other social media influencers grow and work with their brands. I talk about it in terms of giving people a part of the loaf instead of the whole loaf. Is that if you when we're talking about Christianity, or when we're talking about the church, what we're talking about is a whole loaf type of concept. This is life change that we're asking from people.
Yeah.
And you can't ask a person to give you to you can't give a person the whole loaf. You have to give them a slice first. And that's social media. So you just show them, hey, this is a way in which maybe you haven't thought about this principle before, or this is maybe something that's, unique or novel to you. And then they can take a bite of it and they can say, like, is this for me or not? And if the answer is it's for me, then they'll approach you and they'll say, give me another slice. And then you give them another slice. And then eventually they'll say, how can I support you, engage with you, become part of this movement? I'm looking for the whole loaf. And when you have a person who's asked for the whole loaf, when you give them what they're asking for, the I don't want to say the conversion rate, because that's a weird thing to say when we're talking also
Sure.
about the church, but like the business conversion rate is so much higher, because what they're asking for, you're giving them, rather than, I think often when we think about evangelism with the church, we're thinking about kind of tracts evangelism, which is kind of approaching people on the street and saying, like, hey, like, I'm going to make you want this thing that you've never even heard of or that you don't care at all about. And I think that approach is not going to work going forward, if it ever really worked for the purposes that we wanted it to,
Mhm.
versus maybe giving people some hope and some goodness in small bites can lead to something bigger.
I have so many questions for you, John, and I know we have limited on time. You've alluded to the parenting book that you've been asked to write. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, and this is kind of an interesting thing too, because when I was approached to write the parenting book, I actually thought first of writing a book about Christianity, and because that's what I'm really, from an academic perspective, trained and an expert in. But essentially, in growing the platform, which I never intended to grow, I just kind of was giving people in my life parenting advice based on becoming a licensed foster parent and going through that training, based on reading some books myself, based on the stuff that we learn in pastoral care and counseling, and then taking that and going, I became very obsessed with that, and I started like doing deep dives and studies on the brain. And through all of those things kind of coming together, what eventually happened was I started giving my friends and family advice on parenting. And as I gave them advice on parenting and it was beneficial, some of them said, why don't you like post about this? Why don't you tell more people about this? And I had already done that a little bit with Christianity, religious content, and really reframing the Bible for people, and into something that's not only readable but also that you want to engage with. And so I kind of went and said, okay, well, I can do that with potentially with parenting too. And so I did. I started making those pieces of content and it just immediately blew up. And so after I had garnered a couple 100,000 followers on TikTok, and then subsequently, like 9 months later, I'd done the same on Instagram. Then I was approached by a Christian literary agent who said, hey, you know what? A lot of the stuff that you are talking about is it's the slice. How would you like to give people the full loaf? And I said, yeah, like what would that look like? And she said, well, let's write a book proposal together. So she wrote a book proposal with me, just totally out of the blue. My first idea was like, let's write about Christianity. And she was like, no, 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 you have the following for parenting. We'll write a book about parenting. And so we laid out the foundation for what would be a parenting book about the brain, but as written by a pastor who wants to walk people through it step by step.
Oh, nice, nice, nice.
And we made a big deal about that. And then we sent that proposal out. It was picked up by a bunch of different Christian publishing houses. I interviewed with probably 10 of them. And the one that I wound up signing with was called Convergent. It's a division of Penguin Random House. And they were just like, they fit within the covenant really well. They had published a lot of books, including one by Austin Channing Brown, who is a North Parker as well. And they really felt like if I was going to write a book that wasn't about Christianity, but I was going to write it with a publishing house that was Christian, this was
Mhm.
the group to go with. And so I wrote that book. Um, that's a whole separate conversation and process, but really it comes from the idea that I didn't set out to write a book. I was asked. And the whole process is very different when you come to the table as a person who is asked. Similar to when you give somebody a slice at a time, it's very different when they ask for the whole
Right.
loaf.
Right.
It's very different when you're approached by a literary agent and you're not constantly approaching publishers and literary agents. And so yeah, that from that on, I wouldn't say it's been smooth, but it's been much smoother because the process has basically just been dictated to me. Here, do your book, do your edits. Yeah, and so now in January I'll have it. It'll be out.
That's awesome. I look forward to reading that. Um, what would you say is the top three lessons that you've learned from talking about parenting and in your own parenting life? What would you say three things that maybe surprised you, maybe not, but three things that are very basic that everyone should be aware of?
Yeah, the first one is that obedience is not a goal that we want for our kids. And that's been one of the fundamental pieces that I've had to deconstruct in my own living and working is that I approached parenting initially from this concept that obedience was the ultimate good for kids. And it was through research development of the book, but also long before that, that I realized that really we don't, in the same way that we don't want our parishioners to just be blindly obedient and follow exactly what we think about the Bible. We don't want our kids to be blindly obedient either. Now we have to set up boundaries for them. We have to, obviously keep them safe and protect them in many ways from a very difficult and dangerous world, although sometimes not as difficult and dangerous as we make it out to be. We tend to be pretty anxious people. But beyond those boundaries, really, we want our kids to learn to make good decisions for themselves and that you can't, I have a quote up behind me that says, kids learn how to make good decisions by making decisions, not by following directions. And so the ultimate goal of parenting is not obedience. It's actually to raise self-disciplined kids. The second thing that I would say really changed my perspective, and this happened actually before I became whole parent, but was the thing that really triggered all of it was that punishment as a means of discipline is ineffective. And this has changed my perspective on Christianity. This has changed my perspective on how I read the Bible. This has also changed how I am as a parent. And what I mean by that is that punishment motivates us to hide our bad behavior from the person who's going to punish us, not actually behave in the way in which is fruitful for us or others. And so, if punishment is an ineffective tool for discipline for kids, punishment is similarly an ineffective tool for parents and for adults. And so punish if the primary way that we're stopping people from doing something is via punishment, we're actually not near creating the disciplined, ethical people that we're looking for.
Mhm.
And that actually I got, like I said, before whole parent. It was before I read any parenting books. That was from a foster care training that I was a part of, where I was with this amazing foster care trainer. And she just made it very clear that kids who are coming out of foster care, kids who are coming out of some of the most difficult backgrounds, who had some of the most unruly and difficult behaviors to deal with, kids who hurt each other, hurt others, hurt
Mhm.
your family, were traumatized themselves and then turned around and traumatized others, that punishment for these kids didn't work. And that the reason it didn't work is because punishment works against our brains, not with our brains. And that the reason it seems to work for anybody is because the relationship actually wins out. And so learning that punishment is an ineffective tool for discipline, not only for myself, not only for my parishioners, but also for people in general. Not, I'm sorry, I should say not only for kids, but also for myself and my parishioners and human beings in general. Um,
Mhm.
and then the third thing is that we have control over ourselves. We don't have control over other people. And so, we don't get to control how other people act, do things, are. We don't get to control how people engage us. All we get to control is our response. And so
Right.
with parenting, it looks like I have a 2.5-year-old. Sometimes he gets really upset and overwhelmed and in his nervous system, and he lashes out and hits me. Now, I don't think that this is an acceptable behavior. We discipline, we talk about it, we figure it out, usually after the fact, because I've also learned that that's effective. I don't necessarily leverage punishment. I actually don't leverage punishment. That's kind of the whole point. But I'm not saying it's the right behavior, but in that moment, if I'm going to react and scream at him and put my hands on him or viciously shame him or anything like that, that's because I'm out of control, not because he's out of control. We get to control our reactions to things. We get to control how we are going to respond or react. And that, I have an entire chapter of the book about that. But Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning is this Holocaust survivor who even points out that he is able to, in the midst of his concentration camp captivity and torture, he is able to forgive his captors and not be reactive to the ways in which they're trying to trigger him. And if he can do it, for sure, parents with toddlers can do it. I know it's hard. It's hard for me. I don't always come out on top, but for sure, pastors can do it too. You do not have to react to the ways in which the dysfunctional and dysregulated behavior of parishioners who often treat us like their parents. We don't have to react in that way. We can choose how we will respond.
I one of the reactions that I deeply appreciated from one of your TikToks was when you talked about deeply failing one day and then you totally messed up and people may misinterpret your passion for this as I have it all figured out and not if they really know you and not if they really follow you, right? Hey,
Yeah,
let me make
absolutely.
a quick change. John, tell me a little bit about your church. I know that your church has gone through quite a transformation, and we're celebrating how God has moved in your church. What has changed in your church in the last few years?
Yeah, a lot of that it paralleled the journey on social media, but differently. Really it comes from understanding a lot of this stuff. So it is connected, but as I learned more about the brain in order to write a book about how to teach kids, I also realized that many of the practices that we are doing in our churches are not really set up to teach. They're set up for other means. And so whether that is theologically focusing so much on punishment or retribution or teaching those texts where God seems to be condoning and ordaining these things, that type of stuff is one aspect, but also just in the way in which we set up our services. And so one of the changes that we made was shortly after COVID, well, actually during COVID, we started meeting in tables. And the reason for that was to socially distance. We wanted to keep people in pods.
Mhm.
And we just figured if we're going to have all the chairs spread out in these weird ways, it's instead of having 4 chairs over here, it could just be 4 chairs around a table. And we had all these cafe tables from our cafe, and we weren't doing cafe because obviously COVID. So
Yeah.
we kind of moved those into the sanctuary, and it became immediately apparent that when our space reflected more of a cafe environment, that people felt more encouraged to, number one, relax. It didn't feel like church, and people are more relaxed in a coffee shop than they are in a church most of the time. But number two, they also were encouraged to engage, and it encouraged me as their pastor to create opportunities for them to engage. So instead of just saying greet your neighbor next to you once in a service, we started to ask questions as a whole. And people started to like go back and forth with me during the sermon. It doesn't always happen, but if somebody has a question, they raise their hand and we kind of halt what we're doing and we respond. And so as we did that, so that was the first thing that we did. The second thing that we did is that we started realizing that all of the social media growth metrics that we use to grow whole parent, which generally are like provide people small bite-sized value and then just to bless them, right? And then they'll want to engage once they see what you're all about. We started to do that at the church. And so we hosted 2 days of free family photo shoots for people. And instead of running this as like you get a free family photo shoot if you do this for us, or if you do that, we just gave them away. And all we did is we just provided breakfast, and my wife's a professional photographer. She did free family photos for anybody who showed up. We ran a Facebook ad to it. So we actually cost us money. And we did had no expectation of the people who came. No, like you have to give to this thing or anything like that.
Mhm.
Um, and as a result, the people who came were not people who looked like people who were already at the church. Uh, it was just random, right? Because that's what happens when you host an event like that. And it became immediately apparent that there were so many people who were looking for a church like ours, but they were never going to come to a church like ours just on a random Sunday. And so just by being there for one day, we had four families who didn't look or think anything like our church join our church just from the first one.
Mhm.
And so we've done that again. We have another one coming up. And so providing value to people instead of like, look at how great our music is, look at how great our preaching is, or look at how great our kids program is. We just said, hey, we just love you and we just want to bless you in whatever way is available to us. And we did photos because that was something that like we had available. We had a photographer, so we could do that.
Mhm.
Um, so that was the second thing. The third thing was that as we grew in our diversity, it became immediately apparent that there were other underserved populations. And so one of the things that I constantly say on Whole Parent at every single long form communication that I've ever done is I say, you and your child are worthy of respect, dignity, love, and belonging, not because of anything that
Mhm.
you've done, but just because you are. And what I realized was that there was a local group in the area that we had been in contact with for a while. It's called the Covenant Ability Network of Illinois. There is several homes in the area for disabled adults. And what was so surprising to me is that they had no connection to a covenant church. They had a connection to the covenant denomination, but no individual covenant church. And so I said, like, what would it look like? We already had some adults with disabilities attending our church. I said, what would it look like to just say, you are worthy of respect, dignity, love, and belonging? And what was immediately
Mhm.
apparent on the first Sunday that they were there was that the fact that we had tables, the fact that we were already a diverse group, the fact that our service was centered around engagement and interaction actually was the accommodation for this population. And so it was like, man, we want to be here every single Sunday. And for the church, it was like, we want to be here because you're here. So just like really small things of like, oh, this is kind of what you would do on social media, but also how can you do this in person that really, really profoundly impacted the way in which we were able to grow and change and transform. And it's not been without bumps and bruises along the way. People don't, not every person who used to go to our church loves sitting in tables, and some people have voiced that very loudly
Sure,
to us.
sure, sure.
There
But
have
it's
been
new.
other things, right, that have happened that are less ideal. Again, similar to what you said about parenting. Uh, I yelled at my kids yesterday. The subtitle of my book is How to Raise Kids Without Raising Your Voice, and I yelled at my kids yesterday. So like there are places where I've fallen woefully short as a pastor, and we have fallen woefully short as a church to do
Sure.
the best thing.
Yeah.
And it's hurt people in the process. Obviously, that's part of ministry. It's just stuff like that happens. But on the whole, I think we've done a pretty good job. And I think most of the people who are at the church, well, everybody's at the church right now, would
Yeah.
would agree with that.
Well, it's very obvious that God has blessed it, Pastor John. You also have a ministry to the homeless, one that you've actually been even civically involved trying to defend with your village. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the ministry to the homeless that's specifically, so are the organization that we worked with is still going strong. We currently aren't working with them anymore. And the
Mm.
reason for that, we're actually looking for other uses for our building right now because that ended. But the reason that it ended is actually a blessing, and I can kind of speak to that as well as the civic engagement. But the reason that it ended is because during COVID, the government was able to get so much, or these organizations were able to get so much government funding
Yeah.
that they were able to actually build new buildings and not utilize churches as kind of temporary shelters, as well as getting a lot of families housed. And that was our primary goal, was to make sure that nobody in our town slept out on the street, especially during the winter. And that's when our shelter was running. But in the process, we got some pushback, specifically from the village, around the fact that we were opening a homeless shelter, and the optics on that are not always great because it exposes the fact that there is a need for a homeless shelter. And the mayor, who was seeking reelection, did not want, there had been no homeless shelter to this point in our town. And
Mhm.
he didn't want a homeless shelter to open under his leadership because it would expose that there was a homelessness issue. Of course, there had been homeless people, right? There had been
Sure.
just the year before I started as the pastor, a homeless person living in our playground in the back of the church, even though it's in a pretty residential neighborhood. You wouldn't expect that. There are people who attended our high school, people who stayed in our shelter in the first opening weeks who were high school students at Sandburg High School. And so it existed, but the problem was hidden. And our engagement forced that problem into the spotlight. And so we were threatened with a lot of things, including legal action. He sued us for, I don't remember, $250,000 or something like that. I shouldn't say the village sued us for $250,000 and tried to shut us down, and
Mhm.
eventually tried to make us completely change our building into a hotel. That was their kind of plan.
Oh,
They would zone us as a hotel, and then they would make us, abide by those zoning policies. But what was so amazing to us was how simply taking that step of faith and saying, you know what, we're going to keep showing up, even though we were only a church of 50 people, even though there was very little civic involvement of anyone in our church individually. And we were in the process of merging with another church at the time. Many of the members of that church did not think this was a good idea. But in the process of doing that, because we kind of took that step of faith and said, no, we're gonna continue to stand for the least and last and lost. Um, People came out of the woodwork to support us. So not only
right.
hundreds of people from the town of Orland Park jumped onto our email list and donated to our church, raising thousands of dollars for building maintenance and repairs so that we would not have to shut down, but we even had people like a local lawyer who is a Catholic, who was like one of the biggest litigators in Chicago, come forward and defend our church pro bono.
Mm.
And so it's built a lot of connections that have then allowed us to do a lot of other things and host a lot of other events, and do a lot of amazing things. But in the midst, it did look like many long hours and a couple times that I had to stand up in front of a village board and give impassioned speeches. Um, and that's not for every pastor. Not every pastor wants to
Right.
engage in that way, or would would know how to engage in that way. But all I can say is that when you follow scripture, the word justice and specifically caring for the marginalized and the poor is so flagrantly there that if you don't
Yeah.
do that as a church, people will immediately see that as hypocritical. And so
Right.
that has also contributed, I will say, to the church as a whole, as people have seen that and showed up, even though we're not doing it anymore. Almost every person who comes to the church goes, "You guys were the ones who were standing up for the homeless people."
Yeah.
And it's how we've become known in a time when churches are not always known for their best qualities.
Right. Pastor John, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to reading your book, even though I don't have any young kids anymore. I think it will be beneficial to a lot of our parents in the Central Conference. Thank you for your support of our conference and, of course, of our denomination. We're happy that Hope is doing well, and we look forward to great things. God is already doing awesome things, and we expect to see more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just tell you, even though the book is for parents, obviously, and it speaks directly to parenting, so many of the life lessons, as we've kind of highlighted, are just life lessons for people. And so, if you're a grandparent, if you're an aunt or an uncle, if you are a pastor who has no kids but who, is in the care, has the care of parents, um, I think you will also enjoy the book. A lot of storytelling, so it's a good time.
Thank you for your care for our parents. It's obvious
Definitely.
that you care for them and you want people to do well. Thank you,
Thank you.
Pastor. Bless you.
You too.